It's my evening here. I just wanted to, first of all, thank you for allowing me to join and participate in your very, very buoyant and healthy research and teaching community. I'm very excited to be here and to spend this 2 weeks with you, sharing ideas, debating, conversating, thinking about how we can deal with the unfinished business of history. And so what I wanted to do today is really talk about the way in which history kind of lives in many different ways, lives in the body, lives in the landscape, and lives between us, but through the lens of a particular project that I was involved in a few years ago called EUROTAST. So I will share some screen slides with you and just talk very freely about the kinds of work that we are doing. But then I really highly encourage you to ask me questions. I know that this is a very big class in terms of the amount of people here, but my hope is that you will still engage with me, send me your questions, and I can kind of reflect kind of live with you, because I think this is where this meeting point is really where knowledge is really made, in the meeting between us. So everything that I present is really just a provocation for you to think and to reflect together with me. All right, so let me share my screen. So I am, in a way, it's quite interesting having to reflect back and think about a period of time that is now quite a few years ago, where I spent 2 years literally in a genetics lab working alongside bioarchaeologists and geneticists. But over the last few days, as I've been sort of thinking and reflecting about, how to talk about this work with you, and I could do it in many different kinds of ways, it really got me thinking about especially about what happens when you kind of break out of your discipline and ask questions together with people coming from different places, different backgrounds, different experiences. So another subtitle to this talk could be, what the heck is an art historian doing talking to scientists? So that's another way of thinking about what I'm going to talk to you about today. But because I am an art historian, I guess I will start with this image, the image that leads me into this story. This is a photograph of an Afro-Caribbean man sitting in the botanical gardens in Copenhagen in 1875. A place of immense beauty, a healing environment, but also a place for scientific study and specimen archiving. I do not know how this man got to this place, the specifics of his heritage, whether he worked here or was just represented in the gardens for the photograph. In short, I know nothing as yet about what conditions brought this photograph into being. I just know that this man sits looking away from us into the very same place where I would find myself working for this project called EUROTAST, the location where the Center for Geogenetics was and is still currently located as part of the University of Copenhagen. For those of you who have some experience working with archives, or perhaps you're just sensitive to serendipity, you can imagine what it was like when I found this photograph soon after I arrived in a city and country I had never been to before. This unknown man sitting here, there, in this place, raised so many questions, but at the same time also answered the one that was immediately on my mind. What am I doing here? The photograph then became a kind of archival totem, a message reminding me that the past is in the present in the past. It was the haunting I needed to set me on my way. So back in 2012, if I were introducing the EUROTAST project, and this is a kind of morph epithet of the kind of European project on the study of the transatlantic slave trade, hence EUROTAST. Don't ask me, I didn't create the name. But back then, if I were introducing the project formally, I would say the following things: that it was an EU Marie Curie training network initiated by Tom Gilbert and Hannes Schreuder at the Center for Geogenetics in Copenhagen, with the overall aim of supporting a new generation of PhD students and postdoctoral researchers to explore the history and legacies of the transatlantic slave trade across multiple academic disciplines, but with a new focus on bioarchaeology and genetics. I would also probably say that the network encompassed learning institutions from across Europe, in addition to collaborative stakeholders in the Caribbean, Latin America, West Africa, and the United States. This is the group starting our very long and beautiful journey in 2012, and includes not only the members of the project, but at the center, Professor James Wolvin, and to the left, Professor Fatima Jackson, who are distinguished scholars in their field in the study of slavery. Professor Fatima Jackson as a geneticist and anthropologist, and Professor James Wolvin as one of the key writers of the history of slavery in Britain. And they joined us as key stakeholders in our opening project. I would also add that this meeting of science with the humanities provided an opportunity to interpret these histories that for the most part we know by way of historical material, to interpret these histories and their legacies differently. And that the benefits of a training network, so this would mean that it's a network of people coming together to also learn in the process of also doing their own research, that this provided the ability to support professional development throughout the research process, allowing for greater sensitization to the real world consequences and challenges of this delicate work of traumatic history engagement. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means later. I would also highlight that another new approach was to employ postdocs, myself and later colleague archaeologist Colleen Morgan, with backgrounds in public engagement with heritage, to have an explicit focus on dissemination and outreach. And this in practice meant that the project would always have its ear to the ground, so to speak, and a presence in the space of community dialogue wherever we would go. This is a conversation that we were having on the island of St. Martin, which is still in the Dutch Caribbean, having a conversation about reclaiming African identity with historians, but also land rights activists and amazing poets and writers. So in all the places we went to, we were sharing our kind of project knowledge about this blending of humanities with sciences, whilst at the same time meeting these dialogues that were happening about identity, place, memory, what is unfinished, the inequalities that are still left behind in these post, in brackets, colonial spaces. Now, there were some very clear research themes and foci for the project. One, of course, being the application of genomic technology available through Copenhagen University's in-house high-throughput sequencing technology, one of the very few in Europe. I know that I'm not primarily speaking to scientists, so I'll explain that that using this very big, basically data crunching machine meant that there could be a shift from the ways in which we could engage with the issue of genetics. So this meant that instead of using traditional kind of singular strands of DNA work, which is traditionally how DNA had been used in this area, so you could find out information primarily about inheritance, from mother to daughter or from father to son and so on. And this was usually focused on quite fragmented genetic information. But this big high throughput technology meant that, that you could have a more holistic view. And to use a very productive metaphor, instead of just reading pieces of the text, you could actually now access the entire book, right, through this genomic technology. But what does this mean? This basically means that you could actually look at whole populations and see where different communities were coming from, but also how those communities were linked within the continent of Africa, for example, or within the context of the Caribbean. So this basically just meant more data, big data. And we can talk a little bit later about what it means for us to think about our memories, our histories, our lives in the context of big data. Another thematic of the project was the archaeology of slavery, which would basically navigate the material remains of slavery from colonial grounds, such as former plantations in the Caribbean or a recently emerged burial site in the Atlantic Ocean island of St. Helena. But also benefiting from analytic developments in the field, such as proteomic analysis. This could also mean that samples from human burials, such as dental calculus, that's the plaque, literally, that sits on our teeth that most dentists tell us we need to take off. That could be used to signal a much bigger narrative picture about how enslaved people lived. Apologies, this is Sweden. About how enslaved people lived, about what they ate. I'm just allowing the sirens to go. About how enslaved people lived, what they ate, the quality of their gut health, their microbiome, the minerals in the soil nurturing all the produce that they consumed, but also how their environments impacted health. So teeth, this stuff on the teeth that the dentists tell us we need to remove, that actually could lead to answering all sorts of questions about where enslaved people had been, the actual environmental contexts that they moved in. And this meant that in addition to understanding their sort of gut health and their life ways, we could also, for the first time, look at trace minerals in different parts of the West Central African coast and compare them to this material that could be found in the teeth. So this is all like really exciting sciencey stuff that could be done by way of this new genomics and bioarchaeology of slavery. But of course, even as the project was interested in benefiting from this technology and benefiting from these new changes, there were still, of course, many questions, some ethical, some sociological, some philosophical, about what it means really to think about our identities in the context of genetics, rather than in a context of culture, which is how most of us consider our identity, or inheritance between us within families. So one of the core questions that the project grappled with through primarily anthropological and historical projects was the question of identity and how it has been impacted by the propositions offered by genetics as a solution to inheritance mysteries. Could genetics offer a reconciliation around African origins for people in the diaspora? What has been offered so far in terms of ancestry testing? And how have the limitations in this knowledge been handled in the public discourse? And then there was the issue of remembrance. Memory has always been there as part of the context of this work. Embodied memory, as well as memory left within the lived environment, and memory that has been transferred generationally through storytelling and other means. And this issue of remembrance also includes all the ways in which enslavement has been marked and honored in the unfolding process of historical reckoning. This either through public memorials and monuments, as well as the physical journeys to sites of conscience around the transatlantic world that people are making all the time through a certain kind of what that is called roots tourism. Now, I'm not sure how many of you have actually studied the history of the transatlantic slave trade or how much you know historically, but one of the things that I think has been very common in its teaching has been this kind of visualizing of the movement of people and goods around this kind of triangular system between Europe in exchange for goods such as guns and alcohol and fabrics and all sorts of exchange resources from European traders who went to West Central Africa and exchanged these for human bodies, for people. And those people were then transported across to the Caribbean and to the Americas to basically labor on plantations to produce products and extract and produce products such as coffee, tobacco, of course, sugar, which was understood as white gold during the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries, as well as other products such as indigo, tobacco, and of course, in Latin America, particularly silver and gold. So generally, this history has been told and represented in terms of this kind of flow of goods and commodities in which enslaved people were part of that. And this has had, of course, the effect of kind of continuing to represent enslaved people as commodities within this storytelling of the transatlantic enslavement trade. And so part of the work of a sort of new form of scholarship, but also of artists and of storytellers, has been to try and access the lifeways of those enslaved individuals, even if we have very little evidence available. And so it was quite interesting that throughout the EUROTAST project, there was this really important focus on kind of being in place together, going to sites of memory connected to this history, but also exchanging skills between the archaeologists, the geneticists, the historians, so that all of us had to do some form of archaeological digging together. All of us had to think about ways in which geneticists work in the lab and so on. So we were exchanging skills as people at the same time as meeting people who were the descendants of this history and trying to find and broker connections between us. So we moved, basically. And that, I think, is an important way of thinking about another way of producing knowledge, storied knowledge, moving thought. I'm borrowing the words of the anthropologist Tim Ingold, who's written a lot about wayfinding our way through knowledge, particularly through his work, working with the Finnish Sapmi in the northern regions of Scandinavia. So we were kind of learning by doing, learning on the move, learning by feeling and sensing our way through all of these different sites of memory. And so here, for example, we were all cleaning shards from an archaeological dig on St. Eustatius in the Dutch Caribbean. Or we walked through the memorial to enslavement in Nantes in France to reflect on the ways in which Europe's histories were so intrinsically bound with the lives of millions of dispersed enslaved peoples, but also their descendants throughout the Atlantic world. So we walked together in Nantes, and then into the Cape Coast and Elmina slave castles in Ghana on the West African coast. And then traveled by boat to Gorée Island, which is just off the coast of Dakar in Senegal, where we would then walk once more to another door of return. And it's interesting because, you know, again, in terms of the storytelling and the sort of representation of these sites of memory in the present day, if you type in Gorée Island on Google or on Flickr, you will probably find a very beautiful pink residence with a kind of curved staircase, and then a very neat square door known as the door of no return, the door through which enslaved people would leave the African continent, take small boats onto the bigger slave ships, and then disappear into the Atlantic, into what Edouard Glissant calls the womb abyss, in which there was a loss of language, a loss of identity, and an unknowing that of what was to come. So Glissant talks really beautifully about the 3 times unknown in his book, The Poetics of Relation. This is the introduction, which I think is really a really powerful way of thinking about this history. This is Eloy Coily. He is the director and the curator who looks after the Maison d'Esclaves on Gorée Island. And he is pointing to this space of the same door of no return, but from another angle. And there's something about being in these spaces and experiencing history that is very complicated. On the one hand, it's a very affective experience. There are a lot of emotions that people bring and feel in those spaces. But at the same time, they're sites of immense tourism, not just by international people coming to visit these places to sort of have return experiences, but also by local people who also travel to these sites to understand more of this history. And because so many of these sites are now UNESCO heritage places, in a way they have kind of been, for want of a better word, they've been sort of cleaned of a certain kind of a certain kind of residue of history that you can find in places that are not well visited. And so on the one hand, you have the kind of weightiness of history, but also the presence of a very strong tourist economy that is supporting also the local community. And that is a tension, an ongoing tension that was always part of the project, how to reconcile with what was happening at these specific sites of memory, and at the same time around those sites of memory, as local people were trying to ply their trades and make money from the economy that comes with all the tourists that come to visit this historical site linked to slavery. So there were many contradictions, and in those moments of contradictions, I tend to find that meeting others, listening to stories, connecting with people and just hearing from where they come is the best way forward. And these amazing women who were on the island, we actually stayed on Gorée, if you can even imagine it. We stayed on Gorée for almost, I think, 10 days. It was quite intensive. And while we were there, these women sort of came and chatted to us and wanted to find out what we were doing there and why we were spending so much time in this place, in this site of memory. So I just wanted to say a little bit about what happens when someone like myself, an art historian, becomes undisciplined, which is really another way to describe what happens when you leave your home discipline, for me it's art history, and sort of commingle yourself with other scholars. One of the things that happened is that I was able to really spend a bit more time thinking about the medical, biological, the sort of bodily histories of enslavement and the histories of scientific racism as well, which is something that I will sort of end with a point at the end about how this is actually integrated in real life in the conversations that are being had with contemporary geneticists. So I spent time sort of reading different kinds of books. This is just a small selection of the kinds of work that I was looking at. I had, of course, as an 18th century scholar and as someone who had worked on human curiosities through visual culture, already spent time with this material. But I was able to sort of make connections between the historical sort of isolation of individuals as entertainers, really, in the late 18th and early 19th century, with issues of medical segregation and also the theft of biological material in the present day. For example, with the story of Henrietta Lacks that some of you may know, of a woman whose cells have been really central for the development of vaccines such as polio and others, an African-American woman from Virginia who was dying of cancer, and her cells were the first to kind of have their own life in a petri dish outside of the human body, so powerful that they have continued to be replicated to this day. They're known as HeLa cells and used within the scientific community to develop vaccines and other such material. And of course, because of this work, I spent a lot of time talking to educators, engaging with them about how to tell this story, how to talk about the history of enslavement in different settings. This is an inspiration day for teachers in the museum that I was based in Copenhagen, where some of the rare and extinct species that were collected in the former Danish colonies, St. Croix, St. Thomas, and St. John, was sort of put on display, and we could sort of really come close and touch these histories. This is very rare because most natural history museums don't allow you to touch their animal specimens, but in Denmark they have this thing like everything is open, it's fine, you can touch it. And I kind of freaked out for 5 minutes, but then decided, okay, I'll do it for the sake of experience. Another thing that happened, and you know, these are some of the subtle things that happen when you spend time also learning a different kind of disciplinary language. The language of genetics is very much about algorithms, patterns, frequencies, code, flow. Whether it's migration flow, gene flow. And so I really use this language conceptually as a way to help me support my own understanding of the work that I was doing also in print culture. Thinking about, for example, the ways in which images reproduce themselves and how certain ideas stick around in the culture by way of certain kinds of coding. And I will be talking in some of my other lectures this week about the substance of that coding, that colonial coding. But being exposed to scientists, I didn't realize would also open me up to this conversation about data. Something that came up, and this has been sort of central also in helping me think about my recent work and writing about ethics, is when you hang around with geneticists and archaeologists long enough, they're kind of obsessed actually with genetics, with ethics. They think a lot about why, how, and under what conditions you use human remains, but also human samples in living individuals. And they always explain to you that, you know, when you give your genetic sample to a company or to a scientific research project, you are giving your own sample from your own body, but you're also giving the scientist access to like almost 30 generations of ancestors and the people connected to you, which is something that I don't think people necessarily stop to pause about. And one of the things that, you know, my bosses, Tom and Hannah's always used to talk about is that, look, you know, if you ever think about doing a DNA test, talk to your family, because we are also looking at them by way of this work. And this is just a very simplistic way of explaining what I mean, that there's you in the middle, and then there's this information in the mitochondrial DNA, which is your maternal lineage that comes from your mother and your great-grandmother and the great-grandmother and so on. And then there's the Y chromosome, paternal lineage, that kind of comes from all the different fathers. But then there's all those other direct ancestors in the middle, some that you may know, some that you don't. And all of that data is accessible just from the saliva of a mouth swab. And so, thinking about this relationship to genetics and big data, of course, gets you thinking about privacy and how machines identify subjects. And, for me, I've also been thinking recently about algorithmic bias, right? So how machines are in a way, they're the product of human enterprise, right? So they are coded with those old historical biases that come from these colonial histories. This, for example, is when the iPhone X in China was unable to recognize the faces of its Chinese users. So there's always these glitches, there's these moments, there are these problems in the space of technology, which I could, as someone who works with images and visuality, I could make that connection between what is happening in the space of image identification and recognition and what is happening in the identification space of genetics. And of course, we know that algorithmic bias is being used in the present day in different kinds of ways, that augmented realities and also artificial intelligences are being trained to be able to recognize who people are just by way of cameras, but also what values are ascribed to them. Who are they? What is their social security number? Where are they in a society? How much debt do they have? And that being used as a way to make decisions within a kind of a computer mainframe. Hopefully I'm not being too sort of meta, but you can ask me questions if it doesn't make sense. But basically what I'm saying is that by being exposed to scientific research that's really working on the level of really big data. Genomic data is like a ton of code that researchers are only just beginning to sort of unpick and make stories out of, that this could be used in an interesting way to think about what is our relationship to data in the space of culture. And it got me thinking about who is doing the coding, who is owning this genomic data, the big genetic database, the Human Genome Project, who controls all of that data? Is this a situation, once again, that just as Zora Neale Hurston says in her essay, How It Feels to Be Colored Me, which was then used as a text in Glenn Ligon's artwork here, is it a case that we will once more feel most colored when thrown against a sharp white background? Could we understand the database, the cloud that holds all of this data as a sharp white background that in a way puts our differences and our identities just simply into sharper relief? So these are some of the critical questions that spending time with geneticists sort of enabled me to reflect on. But of course, and I'll sort of end it here, of course, I was also invited to Denmark to do this work. And very quickly, even though the project was sort of traveling all over the place and going to the Caribbean and West Central Africa, what happened is that by entering Denmark with the historical sensitivity and awareness about the history of slavery and colonialism, the issues in the context that I was living came into sharper relief. All of the anti-immigrant rhetoric, the unfinished business of slavery and colonialism in the Danish context, which of course I will talk about this week in other projects that I've been doing, but then also the contemporary legacies of that in modern day racist politics, but also the ways in which colonialism was sort of reproduced through everyday commodities, through what we would describe as commodity racism or retro racism in the supermarket, all over the place in a Danish context. These were all things that I noticed as a result of living in Denmark, doing this work with the project, which was kind of abroad, but then being here and realizing, there is another set of questions that we need to ask here in this place, in addition to all the work that we were doing around the transatlantic enslavement route. These are just more images from Denmark, and I've written quite extensively about these issues, and I'm happy to share links to some very open and accessible articles that you can use to begin to think about the presence of unfinished histories as they make their way through everything, children's books, and so on. Also, and this is something that appeared during, and then I got to spend a bit of time sort of talking with the game designers later on, during the lifespan of the project, that a game was produced called Playing History, the Slave Trade. And it contained this element of a slave Tetris, in which basically enslaved people were being packed into ships by the children who were using this game, because it was designed for 10 to 12-year-olds, for tweenies. And of course, this again showed some of the problems of articulation in a Danish context, but also raised these questions about who can actually tell this story effectively. What happens when you try to mediate, when you try to turn this history into something that you can play just like a game? History is not a game, but also how can we produce an artifact like this at a moment when just talking about the Middle Passage is still incredibly sensitive for people all over the former and ongoing Atlantic world. Christina Sharp, in her book In the Wake on Blackness and Being, writes that the weather is the totality of our environments. The weather is the total climate, and that climate is anti-Black. And while the air of freedom might linger around the ship, it does not reach into the hold or attend the bodies in the hold. I'm finding Christina Sharp's work on wake work really useful for thinking about what happens in the present day in the wake of slave ships. And in a way, the EUROTAST project was precisely following the trail of the wake, but also attempting to fill gaps in knowledge around this history by way of these new technologies. I think I will actually end it there, because I would really love to hear your questions, reflections, responses, and you can ask me, well, just about anything at this time of light. And hopefully we can have a discussion about this ongoing process of work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Temi. I'm going to give people a bit of time to use the Q&A function. You find it on the bottom of your screen. It should be open for questions. And maybe while people still think, maybe I will start us off on some questions. Thank you so much. That was, a very fulsome, a very exciting journey through this great project. I have to say, I have a little bit of envy of the because it's taking the time, right, to work with in an interdisciplinary context, which we very rarely have, right? And my sense is, so I will start us off a little bit going back to the question of interdisciplinary research, and what your experience was, how it was to get together to speak different disciplinary languages, and what you think really worked well about creating an interdisciplinary context. We often talk about interdisciplinary research, at least here in Canada, I imagine in Europe and the Sweden too. But what do you think it takes to kind of get this incredibly fulsome conversation that you presented today, to get that actually going, to speak, geneticist with a curator and art historian and archaeologist? I mean, that's not the conversation that we have, that often. So I wonder if you could start there.
Yes, that's a great question. I mean, You know, it's not easy. These things can be quite clunky at the beginning. But I think the way in which the project was structured as training, as a learning experience, I think helped the situation because like learning from one another was kind of built into the kind of the structure of the project. Something that I think came up that was quite challenging. Have we got sound problems? No? Okay. Something that came up that I think was quite challenging was, so I think the historians and the anthropologists were a bit further ahead in terms of the legacies, structural racism, coloniality, all these kind of, you know, intense debates about race and racism and how it works in culture and society. And while the scientists might have known about that in their kind of everyday lives, in the context of their work, it didn't necessarily feature as a kind of prominent conversation. So what really unfolded, especially at the very beginning, is that we sort of had to sort of have a very deep dive conversation about language. What kind of language are we using to describe human populations, for example? When we use the word race, for example, what does it mean in the context of genetics? Well, for them, it means absolutely nothing. But what does it mean in the context of culture? And so we had to keep having these questions kind of unfold between us and show that, okay, there are gaps in knowledge, and we had to sort of allow one another space to explain why certain things weren't there. One of the things that really stuck out to me was a moment where I was asked to do a sort of lunchtime lecture about my own personal research in the 18th century archive with the genetics lab people. So it was solely scientists who came, and I gave a talk about 18th century scientific racism, and they basically looked at me like I had three heads in a building where they still honor and are very committed to some of those, you know, pioneers of biology and anthropology, Carl Linnaeus, Petrus Camper. All those references are still part of the work that they are doing, part of the collections that they're working with. And I came along and said, well, you know, there's like this whole discourse on a racialized discourse and images that go with it. And there was a sort of, I suppose, discomfort, I would call it, with accepting that this history, you know, Linnaeus and Camper, you know, separating human beings into different varieties based on skin color and based on humus, or what was then known as humus, but by character, that this is part of the inheritance that geneticists work with, especially when they're working on human populations. So it was kind of provoking for them to have a humanities person basically saying, yeah, but you know, you have a hop and a skip from Enlightenment theory through eugenics to you. And that's like a very, very loaded and political history. And they were sort of like, no, we don't do race. This isn't, no. So that was something that I sort of, we had to struggle with a bit, but that's part of I think that's been a part of the beauty of the meeting, yeah. Oh, I can't hear you, yeah.
So maybe I ask a follow-up question and then we kind of move into some of the other questions, because I also wonder, what was the biggest kind of moment for you as an art historian to be confronted with geneticists? I mean, you know, is that, I mean, you talked a little bit of how, I think the language, the methodological languages kind of changes your thinking, but do you have a moment where you really thought, oh, you know, this is really changing my thinking, the way you challenged the geneticists and biologists of their assumptions? Did you have to also, I mean, is there a moment where you felt like you were revising your thinking?
Yeah, I think that my current engagement with questions of ethics have been profoundly changed by my contact and engagement with anthropologists and geneticists, and particularly Professor Fatima Jackson, who at the very beginning of the network gave a whole sort of like training session on genetics and justice, because she is one of the geneticists that were sort of called in to do the recovery work of the New York public burial ground after a commercial company was brought in. They mishandled the human remains, and then she came in along with Rick Kittles from African Ancestry and a couple of other geneticists from Howard to come and do more community-based sort of healing work to begin to sort of take care of the remains in a particular kind of way. And so when she spoke about caretaking, ethics, and justice, that had a profound effect on me. I was very moved by her speaking in that way about how to handle the remains. And when she was talking about that, she wasn't just talking about digging up bodies. She was talking about when these remains are with you in the lab, how do you wrap them? How do you take care of them? Where do you store them? The way in which you label them. I mean, she was very specific, and I thought, wow, okay, we're all dealing with traces and remains in different kinds of ways. I deal with visual, which maybe feels like a step away from the human body, but still, how can I also approach the visual with that same level of attentiveness to care and detail? So I'm profoundly changed by this contact, for sure. Yeah.
Cool. Maybe turning to one of the questions, and I also invite you, Temi, to choose your own. But there's a question about resilience, about kind of looking at I think the way I understand this question. What does it mean to do this research? You also talked about community engagement, which means, of course, the question of how to handle the history and traumatic histories often of people with, not just in the abstract, but with communities who are, I imagine, the communities that you talk to have, or many of them have a direct relationship to the history that you were looking at. So here the question is, did you see evidence of resilience in everything you saw? So did the question of resilience come up? Was it but also I would say the questions of engagement with communities in the present, as you're dealing with a history that people have, I think is very important to people's identity. So can you speak to is resilience a topic that came up, or what came up in the questions of community engagement that you encountered? I assume you worked with different communities.
Yes, of course. And I mean, the challenge for us is that we were always on the edge of being, we talked a lot about parachute anthropology, where you kind of drop into a community, you do something and you leave. We didn't get I would have loved to have been sort of based in one community for the whole 2 years, and then we really do some deep dive work. We didn't get a chance to do that, but we tried in all instances for me to sort of go ahead, maybe a week or two beforehand and spend some time kind of getting to know people, talking with people, and seeing how we can connect in a meaningful way, right? But, of course, you enter onto sugar islands, right? I mean, these are still sugar islands. Some of these islands are still producing sugar. And there's a lot of pain still there. And so one of the things that I tried to do is, when we were sort of developing little workshops or conversations also with the research group, is that we allowed for people to express their pain, their frustration with the, colonial structures that continue to exist. I have done this work, this kind of, negotiating community pain in the UK for a long time. So I'd been in big, 200 plus forums where people are telling you that this is their community needs to be seen. So I had already developed a sort of way of understanding that it matters that people are heard, even if it's painful to hear what they are saying. And that was a real learning curve for these scientists who spend most of their time looking at clear pipette tubes, and then suddenly they're in the middle of a land rights discussion. And it's like, yes, your work in the lab is connected to this. So on that level, that conversation was there. But on a personal note, and this is, I think, something that might be useful, hopefully, for the people that are engaged with us today. And that is, you know, there's another kind of resilience that is required to go to these places where history is as close as breath, to go to these places where you can really feel what is unfinished. And I had many times, particularly in the Caribbean, less so in West Central Africa for some reason, and I have to figure out why. Maybe because I was closer to home, but when I was in the Caribbean, I had many instances where I would walk around and just feel immense, profound sadness. I cried on many occasions, not alongside my colleagues, but in my own time, walking around the islands and just feeling my way through an environment that still had so much inequality, that there was still a sort of plantocracy there. And all this I sort of had to process while, you know, trying to figure out, like, how is it that history has not changed as much as I thought it had, you know? So I really had to spend time talking with people and finding a way to accept the ways in which history is unfinished in these environments that we don't maybe spend as much time in. And that takes, you know, a lot of internal mental work. It's, you know, having a good community around you to talk to about these things, having good friendship groups and family and all the support structures you need to deal with the presence of ghosts that are really, I mean, they're really there on these islands. It's not theoretical at all. So yeah, I think that in a way, this project also helped me to build some kind of understanding about how I might work with ghosts, which is how I understand my work as a historian in general, that I work with the dead, I work with ghosts, but that how I could work with them in a more, you know, like a collaborative way, so that they understand that I'm there in good intention and vice versa. Yeah.
Thank you. We are nearly out of time. If you have time I would like to squeeze in another question. I mean, there's much more to talk about. We always need more time. But there's a question from one of the questioners that is very close to my heart, which is in some ways the response to this work by non-BIPOC, by non-Black, Indigenous people of color, so by white people. And your team clearly was had lots of white people on it, but the question of, and I'm teaching a course right now on questions of implication and complicity. So I'm really interested in this with my students. We're pursuing this question of how to engage with being implicated, not on the side of the victims and survivors and descendants of them, but to be implicated on the side of whether that is, the state's role, one's own nation's role in slavery, or, personal histories of, certainly in North America, both in Canada and the US, people have family lines that connect them directly to slave, being, descendant from slave owning classes. Is that something that came up at all? The question of implication in the team, and the question here is about defensiveness that white people like myself often, bring up. And I imagine, I don't know if you want to talk about it in the team, but also maybe in your community engagement, if you did not just engage, if you engage with non-BIPOC communities. Do you want to? It's a big question.
Yeah, it's a big question, but at the same time, I can talk about it in just briefly in a couple of ways. I mean, the first is that perhaps in terms of back to sort of like the ethics around anthropology and genetics, is that certainly for the anthropologists, they had quite a strong tradition of thinking about positionality in terms of their own role, like, what do I bring as a white anthropologist into this situation? How am I reading? How do I make space for other voices and so on? What kind of strategies do I use so that I am not understood as trying to profit from or basically abuse power? Yeah, so the anthropologists on the project had that as a kind of embedded in their training. The geneticists, I don't think they think so much about positionality, because so much of what they do is kind of isolated from the world. It's in these really, I mean, it's hazmat suits, literally. It's hazmat suits and like highly clean environments, which are very sterile precisely so that they don't contaminate, right, the primary evidence. So on that level, the geneticist in some respects is almost understood as being as neutral as possible in order to allow for the stories in the genetic material to be as meaningful as possible. So we could, I mean, we could theorize that all day, you know, what does it mean to understand oneself as a kind of neutral facilitator? But in the case of the sort of phenomenology of genetics, it might be that because there's so much emphasis on kind of not contaminating the data in so many different kinds of ways, that this discussion is not always there. How else was I going to answer that question? But yes, of course, I mean, we entered into, particularly in Europe, I think the conversations that we had in Europe, in France, in Portugal, in Porto, then, you know, we started to experience the usual sort of gamut of resistances to fully seeing what is, to fully facing history. But in the context of, you know, the Caribbean and West Central, but even in West Africa, you know, we had a lot of conversations about the ways in which African cultural conversations about this needed to change. I mean, but there was an understanding and a willingness that, you know, we need to do more about this. We need to educate people more. We need to talk more about this history that people want to forget, you know, for other kinds of reasons. But in Europe, yeah, I think we got the usual, yeah.
Right. I feel like we just got to begin having a conversation. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much for your talk, for getting us to think. Thank you for everybody who joined us today, for coming, I don't know, coming to the screen, coming out, I can't say any longer, coming to the screen in these kind of difficult and busy times. I also want to thank Dr. Andrea Corder from the UFA Augustana campus, who brought Dr. Odumosu to campus and created this opportunity for this conversation. And I would like to thank the Intersections of Gender staff, Rachel Sukivsky and Betty Lee, for all their work in promoting and organizing, doing the kind of admin behind the scene talk. We can never do the work that we do without the staff that really make these events possible. So thank you so much. Temi, I hope we have an opportunity again soon to talk.
There is a question about when is my next webinar. I think it's Wednesday. It's
Wednesday. And I don't have the access for that. Otherwise I would promote it. Where could we, I think, what's the best way to find out?
Andrea. She's always got all the knowledge.
Yes, I think Andrea Porter would be the one to share that information. Oh, there is some, okay, Wednesday at noon. Andrea, who is organizing that? Is it where would they find the information for this talk? Because I don't have it at my fingertips. I don't know if Andrea's, oh, there it is. It's hosted by Modern Languages and Cultural Study and History and Classic at the University of Alberta. So I think if you Google, if you're not at the University of Alberta, but if you Google the name of Dr. Odumosu on the University of Alberta webpage, the information will come up. And I I invite you to come out again to another talk. We have the great opportunity this week of 3 talks, and some other classes are getting to enjoy your work. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody, and good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.